Hello and good evening. Welcome everyone to our webinar, which is one of a series, one could say, about containment strategies in the COVID-19 crisis. Tonight we have the honor of having Ambassador Reaich with us, who is from New Zealand, and New Zealand is one of the countries that could say, well, we made it, and so we are very anxious to hear how the strategy of New Zealand was working out, and especially how they could deal with the tensions in society, because the measures were quite restrictive. First of all, I would like to say sorry for my colleague Reinhard Bütikofer, who wanted to be with us tonight, but unfortunately he couldn't make it because there was a clash of appointments which came in at very, very short notice. So I will say sorry on his part, but I'm happy to see that people are present, although Reinhard can't be with us. And as I said, we are very honored that Carl can be with us tonight. Carl has been New Zealand's ambassador to the European Union and to the NATO since January 2020, so for not a very long time, but Carl has spent quite some years in Europe now. He has also he has worked in the Netherlands, and he has been permanent representative to the United Nations and to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. So he is also quite acquainted with the way we Europeans think, which might be quite different to some of the New Zealand attitudes. Before joining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, in 2009, Carl has worked in a number of legal roles as Crown Prosecutor, as litigator, as legal advisor to the International Red Cross. And he also is on Twitter, I just see in my notes. So I must follow him as soon as this webinar is over. So, but I won't keep you along with the preliminaries, only just very shortly on the rules. You can raise your hand if you have a question. You can also put your question in written form, which you can see at the little dashboard at the side, and we will try to answer all the questions, of course. Everyone is muted at the beginning of the webinar, and for oral questions, I will unmute you and I will use only the first names, because this webinar will be streamed on YouTube, and of course we don't want to violate data protection rules. So I would say that it would be best that Carl does his presentation, and that you are very attentive, and that please spare your questions until the presentation is over, and we will try to have everyone be part of the discussion who wants to do so. So Carl, thanks again for being with us, for sparing your time and sharing with us your experiences in this global crisis, because I think the New Zealand fashion is quite spectacular in terms of what you actually achieved in a very short time. Carl, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. So kia ora koutou, good afternoon. Look, at the outset, let me thank you, Jutta and Reinhard. I'm sorry you can't be with us, Reinhard, but look, thank you very much for the invitation to this webinar. It's a real honour for me to speak about these issues today. But before I really get into the presentation, there are a couple of preliminary points that I think I should emphasise right at the start. The first, on behalf of our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Winston Peters, and all New Zealanders, I'd really like to express the solidarity that we have with the people of Europe as we together face this really extraordinary situation. New Zealanders have watched our friends in Europe deal with the situation with real courage and compassion, and I'd like to really express our aroha, or love and solidarity to everyone in Europe who's been affected by it. There's a very famous Maori proverb or saying in New Zealand, which is he waka eke noa, which means we're all in the same canoe. And it's just a reminder to us that we share the same concerns, the same challenges wherever we are in the world. And it's in that spirit that I join you today. Secondly, I would just say, look, thank you for those very kind comments about how New Zealand has travelled so far with this crisis. But I think it's really important to be quite cautious about comparisons with other countries. As we know, every country has its own unique circumstances, and it can be difficult to gauge what things have worked and what things have not. The one thing we do know is that we can't be complacent about this virus, and we also know that the situation can change extremely quickly. Thirdly, and finally, I should say that New Zealand really approaches these issues with a strong sense of humility. As Minister Peters has said, no single country has a monopoly on wisdom, and we make ourselves safer by learning from the experience of others. So it's really in that spirit and that hope that by sharing our experience, we might be able to assist others. So dealing with, what were the decisive facts for New Zealand? And as I've said, every country is different, and New Zealand is very different. For a start, as you know, New Zealand is geographically isolated. It takes 3 hours to fly to our nearest neighbour. And as an island country of only 5 million people, it means that we had some choices available to us as a country that many other countries did not have. Furthermore, I would say that New Zealand also has, unfortunately, recent experience in dealing with emergencies. In the last 10 years, we've had a series of natural disasters, including devastating earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and other challenges. And further, we dealt with the shocking tragedy of the March 15 attacks in Christchurch last year. So we've had to learn to be a little bit resilient as a country. And really importantly, we were very fortunate that the virus did not arrive in New Zealand until relatively late. Our first case was at the end of February, and so we'd seen what was happening elsewhere in the world, and we had some time to try and prepare. So dealing with the measures that the government and the people of New Zealand took, like the rest of the world, New Zealand realised very early on that we were facing a huge challenge. And in the face of that uncertainty, the government took a precautionary approach. And the approach was informed by two things: the fact that the virus is highly transmissible, and the fact that there is no immunity to it, no human immunity to it. So our modelling indicated that if we did nothing, that could result in many thousands of deaths. And so that was not an option. And that led to New Zealand's approach of go hard, go early. And we could see that countries that had delayed taking action unfortunately experienced an exponential growth in cases in a matter of days. And we looked at the traditional flattening the curve approach, but that risked overloading our health system. And another reason why the government decided to move fast and hard was that if we did nothing, the virus would have very badly affected vulnerable parts of our society. And that includes Pacifica and Maori communities in New Zealand. And the Prime Minister has said that extended whānau or family living arrangements would have increased the risks for elderly people in particular. And in addition, we were inspired by the success of some places overseas where large outbreaks had been avoided. And we could see that some of the things that had worked in those places included having strict border measures, contact tracing, strict social isolation measures, and strong compliance measures. And the government therefore focused on a containment strategy through stamping out the virus. Over time, the government realised that it had the opportunity to pursue an even more ambitious strategy, and that strategy was elimination. In the past 6 weeks back in New Zealand, people have ramped up our testing regime, they've scaled up contact tracing, reinforced border measures, to an extent that we now have a high degree of confidence that our clusters of cases are contained and that our active cases continue to drop significantly. So if you go to the first slide of the PowerPoint, and apologies for inflicting a PowerPoint presentation on you, but if you look at the first slide, which has the summary of cases on it, you can see that today there were 0 new cases of COVID-19 in New Zealand. We currently, in the whole country, have 2 people who are in hospital with COVID-19. Very tragically, we've had 21 deaths, and you can see the number of total cases of just under 1,500 and the number of resolved cases at just under 1,400. And if you move to the next 2 slides, you can see first up the total number of cases, and I think that slide gives a good example of the overall trend in terms of case numbers. And then if you look at the slide after that, you can see the daily number of new cases. And so you can see that for a period from the middle of March until the middle of April, there were a high number of daily cases reported, which gradually tailed off. And over the last 9 days or so, there have been cases of, or days in which there have been 0 new cases, days where there have been 2 or 3. But again, we know that the situation can change extremely quickly, and that we simply can't be complacent and have to remain vigilant. So I'll talk now about the various levels of New Zealand's response. And a key part of the New Zealand government's response was to establish a 4-level alert system. And that system was put in place on the 21st of March. Then 4 days later, the country went to the highest level, which is level 4. In New Zealand, level 4 is where there is a sustained transmission of the virus. People are required to stay at home in their bubbles, with only supermarkets, pharmacies and essential services continuing. Schools and other businesses closed, and everyone was required to stop their interactions with people outside their home. And you can see some images of the lockdown in New Zealand on the next slide. You can see in the middle there, Auckland. Normally that motorway is incredibly busy. Next to that below is my hometown of Christchurch, and to the right, some streets in Wellington. And the lockdown was one of the most extensive lockdowns in the Western world. And you can also see on that slide the teddy bears that many New Zealanders put on display in their windows during the lockdown. The month that New Zealand spent during that very strict level 4 lockdown allowed the government and communities to strengthen the public health backbone of the country. So that involved detection, testing, tracing, isolation, quarantine, infection control, social distancing, and public information. There was a national communications campaign developed to provide New Zealanders with information about the 4 alert levels and what was asked of them at each level. The country moved to level 3 on the 27th of April. And at that level, there's still a high risk that the virus can get out of control and bounce back. And the goal at level 3 is to restrict contact with one another as much as possible. The country will move to level 2 on Thursday of this week. At level 2, there's an acknowledgement that the virus is still present in New Zealand, and there are significant measures to reduce close contact with strangers to prevent it taking off again. But equally, and really importantly, level 2 is designed to get as many people back to work as possible and for the economy to get back up and running, but in the safest way possible. I need to say as well that we have certainly had our share of problems and setbacks. There was criticism that the government was too slow in some areas, that it did too little, and that it acted too late, or that it was not properly prepared. And there's also very real anxiety about how we would handle a second or a third wave of COVID-19. There's anxiety about how will we rebuild our economy? What will we do if there's no vaccine? And about how and when we can safely reopen our borders. But the good results that we've had so far is very much down to a team of 5 million people. Everyone, I think, understood what was asked of them and why it was asked. And it's largely been a disciplined collective effort across the country. It's included all New Zealanders, Māori and Pākehā of all ages across the country. It's involved our businesses of all sizes, the scientific community, academia, civil society, and the not-for-profit sector. We were asked, what measures have been particularly successful and how do you measure that success? And again, it's difficult to state with confidence how things are going because we know that things can change very quickly. But overall, New Zealand's response has been guided by 5 objectives. The first one has been to save lives. Secondly, we've tried to minimise economic disruption and social harm. Thirdly, we've sought to sustain our international connections. Fourthly is about ensuring public trust. And fifthly is about empowering the public. And so to date, New Zealand has done fairly well in our response to COVID-19. And this, I think, comes down to a few reasons. Firstly, and again, we had some time to take decisive action before the virus got out of control. We could control our borders and implement quarantine and isolation measures for people coming into New Zealand. We were able to implement a flexible alert level system that people could understand and could comply with. I think we've also had very good public communications, and the slide you can see now provides some examples of the public communications that people in New Zealand will be very familiar with. And those communications have been anchored in principles of transparency and science. And this has really been borne out in recent statistics about public trust and confidence. 84% of New Zealanders approve of the way in which the government is managing the situation. 60% think the government's measures or restrictions are about right. And 88% trust that the government will make the right decisions in the future. Very importantly, we benefit from good political leadership, strong links with science and the business sector, constructive media scrutiny, and strong institutions. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has received international attention for her leadership and her communication with New Zealanders. And right from the start, the government has focused on kindness and inclusion as being at the very heart of its response to this serious health threat. We are not at war against a foreign enemy. We're uniting to deal with a pandemic. The Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, Winston Peters, has overseen the largest consular operation and repatriation program in New Zealand's history. And he's led our international engagement with his counterparts in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And it's appropriate for me to say, as I talk to an MEP, that we've also had very strong parliamentary oversight with a new committee, the Parliament's Epidemic Response Committee, chaired by the Leader of the Opposition, Simon Bridges. That committee closely scrutinises the government's response over live-streamed Zoom sessions. And you can see you've seen some of the examples of the messaging on that slide, and on the following slide, you can see some of the individuals who've been involved in leading the New Zealand response, and that includes the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and the heads of the Ministry of Health, the New Zealand Police, and the Ministry of Civil Defence. And the following slide, the one after that, you can see the Epidemic Response Committee of the New Zealand Parliament during one of its sessions. The New Zealand government has also been very open in proactively publishing its statistics, information and policy advice so that everyone can see it. And also our political system is consistently assessed to be the least corrupt in the world. But there are many extremely serious challenges ahead of us. Already the pandemic has caused enormous social and economic challenges, especially for a country as dependent on trade and tourism as New Zealand is. The OECD has forecast that New Zealand may be one of the countries worst affected by the economic consequences of the pandemic. Prime Minister Ardern has said that the government will do all it can to ensure that we fight the economic impacts of the virus in the same way as the health threat, and that is with unity, with fast support, and by looking after each other. So dealing briefly with international cooperation, we know this is more important than ever, and we've seen the lessons from the Great Depression and the global financial crisis, and we've learned that it is absolutely essential to resist the siren calls of protectionism and nationalism in a world as connected as ours. And so New Zealand's longer term recovery will need to address both the economic and social impacts of the virus now and the threat of generational impacts in the future. So far as scientific issues are concerned, like others, we are relying on an effective vaccine or a natural attenuation of the virus. The government has urgently funded domestic researchers to undertake COVID-related projects, and many of our researchers are sharing information and approaches with Europe and elsewhere. We're carefully considering how best to access effective vaccines at scale and without having to wait, and work is underway on a vaccine strategy. International scientific cooperation will be an important part of that strategy, including possible involvement with the EU's ACT Accelerator program. It's really clear that scientific cooperation is absolutely essential to a good outcome for humanity. We need to better understand the modes of transition, the long-term effects of COVID-19, immune responses, and the effectiveness of our public health measures. As a Pacific country, New Zealand is also continuing its work with partner countries in the Pacific to help them manage their responses to the pandemic. And so in March, New Zealand provided an initial package of rapid financial support to 12 Pacific countries in response to COVID-19. The task at hand for our aid program is to chart a course where we can tackle both the short-term COVID-19 effects and longer-term strategic issues. And we're focusing very much on strengthening health systems and economic response and recovery over the longer term. So dealing briefly with international trade cooperation, we strongly believe that global cooperation on trade can assist in dealing with this worldwide health crisis. New Zealand has launched trade initiatives to promote international trade cooperation, including a joint ministerial statement on trade and supply chains, and a bilateral initiative with Singapore, which 7 other countries have joined, to ensure the free flow of essential goods for the COVID-19 response. New Zealand has been reassured to see that global food supply chains have remained steady. The strength of these supply chains has shown that the system is working and it reinforces the importance of international trade to global food security. New Zealand remains committed to the current negotiations with the EU on a free trade agreement. And while the FTA will not solve the COVID-19 crisis, trade has to be part of the economic recovery. The conclusion of the negotiations will signal our joint commitment to international rules-based trade, and the deal has the potential to be world-leading on issues like sustainable development. We can show that trade policy can go hand in hand with broader environmental and sustainability policy goals. And certainly we realise very strongly that the challenges we were facing in 2019 have not magically disappeared. New Zealand remains a very close partner with the EU and its member states in dealing with climate change. New Zealand recognises the importance of prioritising action to address climate change issues, even during these difficult and unprecedented times. The world has faced many crises and economic shocks, and they have sometimes or often seen action on climate change deferred. However, as our Climate Change Minister James Shaw has said, this time we could do it differently. This time we could plan our recovery to create a clean tech, high value economy that works for everyone. Just dealing, and I'm getting towards the end, but dealing with our borders, with the domestic spread of the virus currently under control, transmission of the virus across the border is the greatest threat to a resurgence in COVID-19 in New Zealand. So for now, our border restrictions remain in place. But we recognise that our longer term recovery will depend on people being able to travel safely to and from New Zealand. We want to reopen the border and welcome people to New Zealand again as soon as it's safe to do so. As a first step, New Zealand and Australia have committed to working towards reopening our border in a trans-Tasman safe travel zone. It makes sense for Australia and New Zealand to reopen to each other first, not just because we're neighbours, but because we're at a similar stage in dealing with the virus, and we have already a close political and economic relationship. There's not yet a time frame for when the zone will be set up. It will happen when we know that we can do it safely without jeopardising public health in either country. So to conclude, we know that there is a great hardship and many uncertainties ahead of us. We also realise that the virus does not discriminate between people, between countries, or between cultures. And it follows very powerfully, we believe, that we need to deepen our connections and our cooperation as we work together against COVID-19. So while New Zealand and Europe could not be further apart geographically, nor could we be closer together in terms of our values and our shared commitment to democracy and human rights. So once again, as so often in our shared history, we'll work together in the interests of our peoples. After all, we're all in the same boat. So Jutta, that's my presentation. I'd be very happy to talk with you and others further about it. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you very much for these impressions. I think it's very impressive, and oh, that's a nice picture. Who is
a well-known sports team from New Zealand?
Pardon?
It's a well-known sports team from New Zealand at the bottom there.
Oh, okay. Yes, I already have some questions, and the first is, sir, to which extent would you assign your island structure to your elimination success, and how do you incorporate into world economy again now? Volker is asking, and actually I have a similar question because we have that same challenge, of course, in the European Union, where a lot of economies are very, very hard hit, and also the road to recovery might be very different depending on the economy of the member states. For example, Greece, which has a very large touristic sector, will probably have more difficulties to recover, because even though if the border measures are lifted, people may not be so inclined to go on holiday, either because they have lost money and they don't know how their job will go on, or because they say, I'd rather stay home, who knows. So you have said that you also have a very large touristic sector. So those two questions, the island thing, and also how are you dealing with the tourism?
Thanks. Those are both excellent questions. In my remarks, I said that we do have the good fortune of being an island country, and so often it is a difficulty or a challenge. And New Zealand talks about the tyranny of distance, being on the far side of the world, where your closest neighbours are Australia and Antarctica. This is one of those rare occasions where geographic isolation has, I think, been beneficial to New Zealand. But also the fact that, again, we didn't receive or have our first case in New Zealand until the very end of February. And so that gave us time to look at how other countries were dealing with the crisis. We could see rapidly evolving the challenge that other countries were facing. And so we had time to prepare our borders, to prepare self-isolation arrangements, and to be quite deliberate about both our planning, but also who could come into New Zealand, how did quarantine arrangements work. So my guess, and I have to say I'm not an epidemiologist, but my guess is that the fact that we, like Australia and like some other places, are islands, meant that we did have a natural opportunity that countries that share physical borders unfortunately simply don't have. So it's a mixed blessing. There are many great advantages of having land borders with neighbours, and we can see that in Schengen and in Europe. But sometimes there are advantages in being far away as well. So far as the tourism sector is concerned, again, we're, I think, all in the same boat. And I know the OECD study that identified New Zealand as being one of the countries worst affected by this identified a number of other economies that also depend really heavily on tourism. New Zealand's services sector, so far as exports are concerned, tourism is number one, closely followed by the international education sector, where people come to New Zealand for education. And both of those have been extremely badly affected. There have been some days in the last month where no one has arrived in New Zealand at all. So you go from having millions of tourists to no one entering the country at all. It has a catastrophic effect on some parts of our economy. And the government is very, very focused on working with the tourism sector to promote domestic tourism and to gradually, when it's safe to do so, to reopen the borders. And we have a budget by our Minister of Finance later this week, and people will be very interested in what the government is doing as its overall response to this emergency. And I would anticipate that those sectors will be of particular interest.
Okay. I have another question from Christina concerning tracing apps. Did New Zealand use tracing apps at all, or were you just, just is maybe the wrong word to use here, as you had a very, very strict lockdown, you probably did not need a tracing app to in the stage that you're in now. But maybe when, that's a discussion that's going around the European Union a lot, and it's discussed very differently in the different member states. And of course, data protection is a very large issue, but also the health officers who say it's impossible to trace so many people. We need technical help. Are there discussions on that in New Zealand too?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And there has been very careful consideration about tracing apps in New Zealand as yet. There isn't a tracing app, but there has been a lot of work and a lot of effort put into New Zealand's tracing capabilities. And if you go online, you can find a wealth of information about the way in which New Zealand has tried to ensure that we have an effective tracing capability. The Minister of Health, David Clark, said a couple of days ago that a contact tracing app is well developed and is expected to be released for voluntary registration very soon. Of course, there are issues about privacy, and the government has a chief digital officer who's been closely involved in that. But for the time being, so far we haven't had a government-launched tracing app.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting, and I had actually put down some questions. How did you enforce your lockdown? Were there police driving around looking whether anyone is out in the streets? And what happened if you were, well, violating the rules?
So I think that, yes, certainly there were breaches of the rules. People are human, and I think some ministers have described this lockdown as, the greatest infringement on New Zealanders' civil liberties in our history. So there's no underestimating the extent of the lockdown, and yeah, it certainly was enforced, but the government's real objective was to enable everyone to understand what our shared objectives are, and through that understanding seek people's cooperation, because people realised that lives are at stake, and people needed to be able to understand, why are we doing these things? How are we doing them? What are the expectations? So the focus from the police and from the government has very much been about engaging with people, educating them about what is required, and really encouraging compliance. If those steps didn't work and the situation was serious, the person might receive a warning from the police, and if repeated warnings did not work, then prosecution could be appropriate. And there are provisions in New Zealand law to impose a fine on people who did not comply. In some cases, people could be arrested, and ultimately a judge could impose a period of imprisonment. And there was certainly a lot of attention in New Zealand, a lot of people very concerned about people not complying with the requirements, and it was possible for people to contact authorities to report non-compliance. But I think, and I have to say, I wasn't in New Zealand during that period, so I can't speak firsthand, but my understanding is that generally there was a really high degree of compliance in New Zealand, and quite a low number of fines or prosecutions, and very much the focus was on encouraging and educating rather than waving a big stick at people.
How was what kind of test strategy did New Zealand use? Because in Europe we had the problem in some member states that there were not enough tests available, so that tests would be restricted to people that had symptoms, had contact, so you had to sort of go through several stages before anyone would say, okay, we will actually test this person. And the country I live in, Germany, we had the luck of being able to build up test capacities rather quickly, also due to Christian Drosten, who's a very famous virologist now, and he has been working on coronavirus. I mean, there's more than one coronavirus, obviously, and he has been working on the family of coronavirus for more than 20 years. So he had a lot of experience. He could share also his testing. But was there a sort of staged approach, or were there always sufficient tests for everyone? Are you already doing antibody tests, or is this still for the future?
Yeah, so I think for every society, testing has been a difficult issue, both in terms of when to test, how to test, and just having sufficient numbers of tests. And this was certainly is a very important issue in New Zealand. And there was a real focus by the government to increase the testing capability very quickly, because as you've indicated, it's extremely important to have reliable testing to provide data about the transmission of the disease. So I'm not an expert on the criteria that were applied for testing, but there was a real focus on increasing the availability of testing. And I understand that currently New Zealand has one of the highest per capita testing rates in the world, which isn't to say we're doing it perfectly, but I think from early on there was a real focus on the importance of reliable testing.
Okay, one last question from my side, and then I'll give the floor to someone who has raised her hand. You were talking about the importance of public health and availability of medicines for everyone, leave no one behind, and that this is the approach that New Zealand is taking. And concerning vaccines, there is a discussion running in the European Parliament a little bit, and we Greens are actually pushing for a compulsory licensing for any vaccine that's being developed, so that there may not be a monopoly from one company who has exclusive rights on the vaccines, but that there especially when public money is involved, of course, that there must be compulsory licensing in order to have the capacity of providing everyone with a vaccine who needs it. Are there discussions in that line in New Zealand too?
New Zealand's vaccine strategy is still being developed, and I think our priorities are to ensure that we have early access to a reliable vaccine. And yeah, no, we're very much following with great interest the deliberations of the European Parliament. We understand the scope of the questions that you've raised. To be honest with you, I don't know whether we have settled on an approach yet, but as always with pharmaceuticals and vaccines, those intellectual property issues and ownership issues are important and can be difficult to resolve. So for the time being, rest assured we're following those issues really closely, but I don't think we've got a definitive answer to those questions just yet.
Okay, thank you. I have a hand raised by Katrin, whom I will now try to, yes. Katrin, if you unmute yourself, then you can come up with your question. Go ahead.
Yes. Yes, hello, good evening. Ambassador, thank you very much for these very interesting insights into New Zealand's approach to the COVID-19 crisis. I'd be interested to know how you assess the potential for present and especially future cooperation in the framework of the WHO. I mean, how can we have even more people learn from the experiences that you made, but also from the other regions that we have covered in these webinars so far, like South Korea or Taiwan? What do you see? What potential do you see for that? Thank you.
Well, I know that our Prime Minister has said very publicly that this is a time when we need to be sharing information and that we need advice that we can rely on. And that's something that the WHO has been doing. And we also know that the global response to this pandemic requires a really strong World Health Organization. So I think it behoves all of us to support the WHO in its endeavours. And I certainly know that New Zealand will continue to play its part in supporting the WHO's activities globally, and particularly in our region in the Pacific.
Thank you. I have actually another question, which is a little bit in a different line, but did the government provide economical help to certain sectors, such as restaurants, bars, artists who are often self-employed and who often don't have any income now for months and months to come? And in Europe, that's a very big issue because it does affect a lot of people, and people are also afraid that our cultural scene may never be the same again.
You know, it's a good question, and certainly the government has been very well aware of the enormous economic impacts imposed by the pandemic, and that were posed by the very strict lockdowns that in New Zealand and elsewhere in the world we experienced. So very early on, the government rolled out a wage support scheme, whereby, and I think around 1.75 million New Zealanders are currently being supported by that wage subsidy scheme out of a population of 5 million. And so far, the government has spent around about 10 billion New Zealand dollars. So it's been a very substantial investment in sustaining the economic well-being of a large number of New Zealanders. And that has applied right across different sectors that have, it hasn't been sector specific, so it's been across any activity or business that has been significantly affected in terms of loss of income by this crisis. That's been a successful initial approach, and I'm sure that the government will be announcing further steps over the days and weeks ahead. And I have to say that in New Zealand, again, because the virus arrived relatively late for us, we've had the advantage of being able to see how our friends and partners overseas have been grappling with these issues. So my colleagues in New Zealand embassies around Europe and in other parts of the world have been looking with real interest at how other advanced economies deal with these issues, and that helps inform our decision making back in New Zealand. So I shouldn't pretend that we're at the front and the cutting edge of these issues. We've been really fortunate to be able to see how others have been dealing with it.
Is there already a plan concerning, well, large events? Like I just remembered your last slide with a sports team, because that's in Germany, that's a big debate on will the soccer teams be able to play again, and which restrictions should be there. And of course, they will not let people visit those games. And is it still the same game when no one is watching? And I think you're very keen on rugby, aren't you?
New Zealanders are very keen on rugby, and it's certainly
that's
been,
what I meant. New Zealanders are famous for being keen on rugby.
Yeah, so there has been a lot of interest in terms of what impact do these restrictions have on sport in New Zealand at all levels, both professional and kind of children's and everyone's ability to play sport. It's such a big part of everyone's lives. And in front of me, I've got this very detailed document here, which is New Zealand's COVID-19 alert levels, which runs to 4 pages, and it provides a lot of information about particular activities and what is permissible at what level. And I know that our Minister of Sport has made announcements about when sport and contact can resume in New Zealand, and it's certainly a subject that is receiving a lot of attention. From the top of my head, I don't know when professional sports will be resuming, but rest assured it will be closely watched in New Zealand when it does resume. And I should say that for anyone who's interested in finding out more about any of these issues, about our experience, there's a one-stop shop government website. And I can share the link with you, but if you Google COVID-19 New Zealand, you'll easily find it. And the answer, I think, to all of these questions is there, and probably expressed in a more articulate and easy to access way than I can provide it.
Yes, I have another question from Volker. There seems now to be a discussion about the legal status of the lockdowns. Any comments?
Yeah, there has been a lot of scrutiny about the legal status of the lockdown. Our Attorney General, David Parker, has provided the government's views about the legality of the lockdown. There are commentators who've suggested different views, and it's likely that these issues may end up going before the courts. So it's probably best for me not to offer a view on that. But for people who are interested, if you go onto the New Zealand government website, you can see what the Attorney General, our Chief Law Officer, has said about the legality of the lockdown.
Okay. Okay. I mean, in Germany, there's an emergency paragraph, so to speak, in law. So when activating this paragraph, that's the legal base in Germany for the lockdown, or we didn't have a real lockdown. Sorry. I mean, if you look at what New Zealand did, what France did, what Spain did, that was not a lockdown in Germany, but still some people were like, well, it's our basic rights that are being impaired, and this is not okay. One other question, which was a very big issue in Europe, as you probably have noticed, is the shortage of protective clothing, the shortage of masks, the shortage of medicines. Did you encounter anything like that in New Zealand too?
Yeah, no, there were certainly issues about the provision of personal protective equipment, and I should say one of the functions of having a parliamentary democracy is that the Epidemic Response Committee had many questions about the supply of masks and equipment to the people who needed it. So it was certainly an important issue. And received a lot of attention in New Zealand, and I think it has in practically every country, and we're certainly no exception to that. I mean, right now we have this discussion in Parliament concerning relocation of certain industries to Europe, and maybe we just overstretched globalization, thinking that everything would be fine if we just would pay the lowest price for certain goods, and now we're just seeing the other side of the coin, so to speak, that you cannot in this crisis provide your people with the basic needs, the essential needs. I found it very impressive in the webinar which we had with Taiwan, that Taiwan ramped up its face mask production to 37 million a day within some weeks, and I was like, okay, wow. But of course they had the SARS experience, and so they had their plans actually in the drawer, and when the WHO said, okay, there's something fishy here, they just opened the drawer and said, okay, we'll start tomorrow. Ambassador, it's been a very short hour, so to speak, and we do have to leave the room very, very punctually, because there will be another webinar tonight and the technical things have to be set up. I'm very happy that you
took so much time for us and were so patient with all our questions. And I'll look forward to maybe meeting you in person when we are, someday we will be allowed to go to Brussels again, I guess, and hopefully that then the restaurants and the bars will be allowed to open again, which would be very nice. So we could have a beer together or something. For everyone listening, Philip has just put it in the chat that our next webinar on the COVID line will be on Monday with the title, Where Did COVID-19 Come From? And we'll have very interesting guests from research who have been looking for a long time between the interconnections between habitat loss and pandemics. So, Carl, thank you very much for being with us. To everyone listening, thanks for your interest. To the technical staff, thanks for your help. And to everyone, have a nice evening. Stay healthy. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.